Thank you, Kai, and thank you everyone for allowing me to be of service. My name is Dylan, and I'm an alcoholic. Uh, Feels weird not to get the little welcome back and being online. I was talking to Kai a little bit, before I get into my story. It's awesome to see that this meeting's been going on for so long and going so strong. It really brings me back to getting sober during Zoom and kind of how we've evolved efficiently as a group to give the best meetings. So whenever I like to share my story, I like to kind of think about the third step prayer. And talking about in that part where I asked my conception of God to take away my difficulties, so that victory over them can bear witness, right, to those I would help of their power, His love and way of life. And the reason I share that is I got sober a month after I graduated high school, and I have been very fortunate to have not relapsed in 11 years. And I share that because I think it's a testament to the program of AA, and living in this program. It doesn't have to be part of your story. And for me, whenever I think about like what makes me an alcoholic, right? There's a lot of stuff in the big book, but the thing to me that always kind of stands out is that quote that men and women drink because they like the effects produced by alcohol, right? And that was my experience. And I remember when I was a little kid, like 3, 4 years old. I wasn't in school yet, but I can I can remember that I used to have these like really heavy emotional like outbursts, right? And I'd be freaking out. I'd have these tantrums and like all these things, and my parents would, try and help. So sometimes they'd strap me in a car seat and lock me in the car and leave me there until I calmed down. Sometimes they'd put me in a cold shower and just leave me there until I calmed down. And I remember, I didn't understand what was going on, but the thing I do remember most about that experience is that like I didn't see my other siblings going through that. I didn't see anyone else going through that, right? And what I did know is that something was wrong with me because no one else was going through this but me, right? And so from a very young age, like I started to understand that something was different from me. And the longer I knew that, the more it became evident to me that like something was wrong with me, right? And going back to that piece about the effects produced by alcohol, like alcohol gave me a lot, right? Like the first thing that alcohol really did for me, was I got to be a part of for the first time ever, right? Um, when I was, sixth grade, seventh grade, um, I remember like, the stories aren't important, but what I do remember specifically are all the moments where I felt like everybody was laughing at me, right? And where I was like, whoever I am in this moment, the world is telling me it's not okay to be this person, right? And I remember feeling like I do not ever want to go through the pain of being the absolute butt of the joke and the laughing stock, right? And when I started drinking, I was a freshman in high school. I was playing sports. I was hanging out, with kids who were 17, 18 years old and going to these parties. And I remember, like, if I just made an absolute fool out of myself, I got to feel like I was a part of, right? And the best way to do that was to drink and do stupid things. And everyone was laughing at me. But in that moment, I didn't feel like they were laughing at me, right? And alcohol was a catalyst for the first time in my life of feeling a part of. The other effect that alcohol gave me, which I really loved, was that it gave me a story to tell. Right. When I was 18 years old, I was headed down to Florida. I was, I guess, technically at boarding school at that time, in Massachusetts. My parents had shipped me up there, and I'm originally from New Jersey, so it's not close, but it's not far. And I remember we were going down for 2 weeks to play in this basketball tournament. And I remember, I was staying at my buddy's house and I was like, dude, we have to get alcohol for this trip. Like, I'm not going to Florida for 2 weeks sober. Like, well, like, come on. So we biked about 3 miles to a liquor store, got a homeless guy to buy us you know, three handles, but that's only like 10, Poland Spring water bottles full of alcohol. And I was like, this is enough, man. Like, we're there for 14 days. Like, you and I are going to drink one, and like, we need more. And he was like, all right. And so we biked to the train station. We took the train into Boston, downtown Boston, and we went and we found a bunch of homeless people and got them to buy us even more alcohol at like 2 or 3 in the morning. And we missed the last train back, so we had to take a train like 20 minutes, and then we had to bike for like basically 2 hours to get back in time to pretend to be asleep to get woken up and get on the flight going down to Florida. And I remember the whole time, like I've got backpack full of these handles, and I'm unbelievably miserable. But I'm like, I cannot wait until the moment when I get to get drunk and when I get to tell this story later on to like all the kids on the team and all my friends. Like, this is gonna be such a good story. And that's what I live for, like getting drunk and having the stories that I got to tell people to make them think I was cool, because I hated myself and I did not feel like I was cool in any way, shape, or form. And the last, the other thing alcohol gave me is it gave me a scapegoat, right? Like I could get drunk and I'd wake up the next day and people would tell me what I did, and I'd be like, I'm sorry, man, I was drunk, like I ended up in the wrong bed, like, sorry, babe, I cheated on, like, I was drunk, and it was the perfect scapegoat. Like I felt like I could get away with anything. If I was drunk, it didn't matter. And then eventually I reached a point, where it talks about in the big book, someday he will be unable to imagine his life with alcohol or without it. Then he will know loneliness such as few do, and he will be at the jumping off point. So I graduated high school May 26th of 2013. And a month later, I ended up in rehab. Um, During that month, I finally got to drink and use drugs with impunity and around the clock. And I remember, about 3 weeks into, being a high school graduate, I was like, this is, my problems are worse. I had no one around, no future prospects. I was like, how did my life end up here? I used to have dreams, goals, hopes for the future. And now I'm trying to figure out how I can transport a bunch of drugs from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to upstate New York to sell the drugs, to buy cocaine, to then be cool at college. I was like, how did this, like, my life end up here? And I remember in the big book, it talks about in We Agnostics, which is the first thing I ever read, like how many alcoholics looked up to the stars and wondered what more could there be. And that hit me because the last night that I was ever drinking and using drugs, I was tarring driveways at the time, and I had a couple buckets full of tar, and I was sitting on my driveway, looking up at the stars, like there's got to be something better to life than this. Because right now in this current moment, I want to die, and I'm 19 years old. Like that doesn't feel normal. Something's wrong here. And I was fortunate enough to be 12 step by my neighbor who had about 13 years sober at that time, and he's a former bodybuilder and bouncer in AC, and he had tattoos all over, sleeved up. I just remember thinking this dude was like the coolest, toughest guy I ever knew. And so he took me to my first meeting. Actually went to 5 meetings in 5 days before I went to rehab. I remember telling my parents, like, I need help. Can you please send me to rehab? But I want to go to the rehab that my buddy just went to. And they're like, is this the same friend who you were like partying with 2 weekends ago? I was like, yeah, he doesn't have a problem anymore. Like, send me to that one. They're like, I don't think so. And I remember going into rehab. I didn't know you were supposed to have like a last hurrah, right? Like everyone shows up messed up, and I was 5 days sober going into rehab. So that was on like my first 3 or 4 fourth steps, being a little resentful about that. Um, and At that point, I just totally lost everything, right? Like I was pretty willing. I remember showing up in rehab, and I remember everyone was like watch out, dude. They're gonna make you do aftercare. You're gonna have to go to like a halfway house or something. And I was like, not me, dude. I'm special. Like, absolutely not. And so about 3 weeks in, they did make me do aftercare. And I remember my parents were like, "You're going," and I was like, "Absolutely fucking not. I'm not going." Um, and so I walk into my group that day, and the the clinical director for the whole rehab's running my group, and we have to like check in, right? And I'm like grateful because like I bought a new car before I went to rehab. Granted, it was like a 1994 Jeep with like 200,000 miles, so I was like really crushing it and really happy. And then like the emotion, like feeling word, like what's your feeling word, Dylan? I was like pissed off. And this like 65-year-old man proceeded to call me like a spoiled brat and all sorts of different things. And I remember sitting there, and I was like, I'm gonna beat this old man up. Like there's no way, like absolutely not. Um, and so I left group and I was like sitting on my bed, and this is where I had my first, experience with a higher power in the steps. And I remember sitting in my bed and the thought popped into my head, what if he's right and I'm wrong? And my entire life, I'd never considered that premise. I had always been right and everyone else had been wrong. Even when I was wrong, they were wrong. It didn't matter to me. And the next thing that happened to me was the thought popped in that I'm afraid. And that was the first time in my life I'd ever been honest with myself that I'd been afraid from basically my first memory, and that I had lived my life gripped and terrified by fear. Um, and so after this, I went up to the guy and I was like, "You're right, I'm wrong. I'm absolutely terrified. I'm 19 years old. I don't know how to live life, and you're telling me that I can't do drugs and alcohol, and that's like that's what I love to do. Like, what do I do?" And he was like, "Go to a meeting as soon as you get out of here. Get a sponsor. Work the steps. That's the best hope you got at staying sober." And so I did. I got let out on a Friday. I went to a speaker meeting that Friday. The guy shared, and he had 18 years, and I didn't necessarily have a lot in common with him. Um, but he shared. He had a lot of time, and he didn't raise his hand. And I went up to him afterwards, and I was like, "Will you sponsor me?" And he was like, "Sure." Like I wouldn't, but I will. So that's something I've tried to carry, that I will never say no to anyone who asks me to sponsor, no matter how busy I am to start, because if I'm grateful for that experience with that sponsor, then I should proceed to do the same thing myself. And so I started doing the steps, right? I got into the step work. I waited about 90 days to do the fourth and the fifth step. Everyone when I was in early sobriety talked about how scary that step was, how terrible it was, yada yada yada. And so my sponsor would just sit there with me, and I would write my inventory for like an hour or two a week because I couldn't do it alone. And I read my fifth step not to my sponsor but to my grand sponsor, a complete stranger who I'd never met before and haven't seen since. And I had a spiritual experience. I left that moment in time, and I understood that what the program had to offer was something special. And then I started doing amends, and I had breaking and enterings and robbery and all these different things. And I was like, I'm back. I'm gonna go to college. I'm working a job. I got a girlfriend. Like, I don't really want to go to jail. Maybe I'll just sit on these. And so I did. From about 9 months to 21 months, I went to maybe 2 meetings a month. Didn't have a sponsor. Didn't work the steps. And at 21 months, I ended up in a situation surrounded by a bunch of people who had relapsed and faced with the decision of what was I going to do. I could drink and drink with the people who I thought were sober and my friends, or I could stay sober. And it was in that moment that I went outside. I picked up the phone. I called that same neighbor who 12 stepped me, and he talked to me, and he's like, "You're going to call me tomorrow. You're going to call me the day after that. And when you get home, you're going to go to a fucking meeting, and we're going to start doing the steps again." And it's because I took that action that I got, some of God's grace and was able to stay sober. Um, I proceeded to do a couple more amends, and then I waited another year. It's been my experience that I didn't complete all 12 steps in order. to a sufficient completion until I was about 3.5 years sober. I do not recommend that, but that's something I always like to talk about because I was in more pain at three, at 3 years sober. I was supposed to celebrate and pick up a chip at a meeting in New York City. And I made up a lie to skip it. And I went and I cried alone because I was like, I have no hope. I have no experience. I have nothing to offer anybody. I'm a complete fraud. I've never done the steps. And I'm more unhappy today than I was on day one of being sober. Um, and I was like, I made a decision that day that I was going to do the steps. And then 6 months later, I took action and I got a sponsor and did the steps, which is pretty good for an alcoholic. I'd say like a 6 month time lag is pretty good for someone like me. I remember right after I completed the steps, part of my experience is that I was assaulted, molested, and sexually abused by someone when I was in high school. And when I was roughly 4 years sober, I went and testified for 5 days in open court against this former coach who had abused and molested me because someone came to me and essentially asked me to come forward because they wanted to seek justice against this individual. And it was really terrifying, but I remember in the middle of it, I was talking to my sponsor and I was like, I really thought this would fuck me up more than like it has. And he was like, why? He's like, do you have a service position? I was like, yeah. He's like, are you doing the steps? Yeah. He's like, are you going to meetings? You have home group? I was like, yeah. He's like, you're living inside the triangle of AA. He's like, that's a bomb shelter. Like whenever you're inside that triangle of AA, it's you and God, and you're protected against anything you could ask for. And that was the first time that I truly understood this program worked in its capacity. So what my life is like today. I moved to Colorado 4 years ago in the midst of COVID to come out here to go to graduate school. The state of Colorado somehow allows me to practice as a state licensed therapist, which is insane to me. Um, and when I was first moving out here, I didn't know anybody. It was during COVID, so in-person meetings were pretty infrequent, and there was no fellowship. And so it was for the first time in my life that I was truly alone. I was alone, like alone for roughly 9 months, and I was trying to find a young people's fellowship. I got sober in Minnesota. They had great young peoples out there. I spent a lot of time in New York City after that with great young peoples in New York City. Um, and I was just trying to find a community. And I was sitting with a group of people talking about how we couldn't find a community, and someone just goes, "Why don't you start a meeting?" And I sat there and I was like, because I don't know how to, and I'm afraid. And I was like, well, those aren't good reasons. So me and two other guys started Saturday night young people's meeting, which is still going strong. And when I moved out here, I really couldn't have imagined what that life was going to end up being like. I was, like I said, hiking and skiing and doing all these things alone. And I was like, I would give anything to have a community of people to just be around again in my life. And maybe it's not for me, and maybe I got really lucky with my first 8 years having that. But it's really been a blessing to be out here, and WACYPAA is another huge part of that. It's not all great though. Like part of this program is that trudging the road of happy destiny. For the last since November of 2022, I've been dealing with like chronic and debilitating health problems where I wake up on a day-to-day basis and I've got vertigo and my balance is off. I've got issues with my eyes. Things are blurry. Things are out of focus. I can't quite see. I get debilitating headaches. I've had to take long periods off work. I've had to go periods where I can't go to a meeting and I listen to speaker tapes and hop on things like this. But the one constant has been that like I stay connected to this program. And even when I'm not feeling great, I still try and go to meetings. I still show up for my commitments, right? Thanks to my commitments at my home group and WACYPAA, I've still stayed in touch and they've given me a lifeline while I'm going through this. So that's pretty much all the time I got. Thank you for letting me be of service. It's been a true honor to be on this meeting. and I hope I brought you a good message of hope and recovery. Um, Thank you very much.